What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Recently, the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, said that nobody gave Putin permission to use the territory of Belarus as a bridgehead for subsequent invasion of Ukraine. So, it looks like that Putin lied to Lukashenko back in 2022, said that Russians are there just for practice, and later ignored all the warnings and still used the territory of another country as his own. For almost 3 years, Lukashenko was silent about this matter, but looking back, the signs were there. Belarus never provided actual military support to Russia. Its soldiers were never fighting alongside Russian army, at least officially. And every meeting between Putin and Lukashenko were very cold and meaningless. They even stopped seeing each other for a long period of time, terminating all the communications completely. Since the initial invasion, we don't see much activity to the north of Ukraine. Maybe a couple of drones are launched here and there, but it's nowhere near close as the activity to the northeast, east and the south of Ukraine, where Russia shares direct border with this country. So, what changed? Why Lukashenko kept his silence for so long? What made him speak now? And what was the goal of this statement, and how will the future of Russian-Belarusian relationship look like? After all, Putin always considered Belarus as his major ally. Is it finally the time when even Putin's friends started to turn away from him? Let's talk about all of this in today's video. In the years leading up to 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, the relationship between Russia and Belarus was marked by both cooperation and underlying friction. Historically, these two nations have been close allies, bound by shared Slavic heritage, language, and deep economic ties. They are members of the Union State, an agreement aimed at deepening integration, and they participate in various military and economic alliances, like the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, the equivalent of NATO, kinda, and also the Eurasian Economic Union. However, beneath this facade of unity, tensions started to rise. Just like in personal relationships, sooner or later the sides start noticing small things about each other that they do not like. But President Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus had long pursued a delicate balancing act. On one hand, he relied heavily on Russian economic support, including subsidies and favorable energy deals that were crucial for the Belarusian economy. On the other hand, Lukashenko was aware of Putin's intentions to absorb Belarus more fully, fearing a loss of sovereignty. Maybe not in terms of territorial control, but more about the political control. Lukashenko will remain the president, but he will follow the orders of Putin. Exactly what happened when Dmitry Medvedev was president of Russia, but we all know who was really in charge. That was Lukashenko's major fear. In 2019, negotiations over deeper integration under the Union State framework intensified. Russia pushed for more profound economic and political involvement, which Lukashenko resisted. He was particularly opposed to proposals that could diminish his authority or make Belarus overly dependent on Russia. This resistance led to disputes over oil and gas prices, with Russia temporarily cutting supplies to just put pressure. The situation escalated in 2020, when Belarus held a presidential election widely condemned by international observers as neither free nor fair. The election sparked massive protests across Belarus, threatening Lukashenko's grip on power. Isolated from the West due to sanctions and criticism, Lukashenko turned to Putin for support. Russia provided political backing, security assistance, and economic aid, helping Lukashenko suppress the protests. It was either Lukashenko solves his problems by himself and risks losing the power, or he asks for Putin's help, retaining the power but becomes more dependable on him in return. Despite this assistance, Lukashenko remained cautious. He understood that increased reliance on Russia could jeopardize Belarus' autonomy. Thus, on the eve of the Ukrainian invasion, the relationship between Russia and Ukraine was one of the mutual necessity, but also mutual distrust. As tensions mounted between Russia and Ukraine, Belarus found itself in a very difficult position. In early 2022, Russia announced joint military exercises with Belarus, called Allied Resolve 2022. While such drills were not unusual, the scale and timing raised international concerns. Tens of thousands of Russian troops, along with heavy military equipment, were deployed to Belarusian territory for training purposes. But reports suggested that President Lukashenko had not granted full permission for this extensive military buildup. Sources indicated that while he agreed to the exercises in general, the sheer number of troops and their strategic positioning near the Ukrainian border exceeded what was initially discussed. The lack of transparency from the Russian side left Lukashenko once again in a very difficult situation. The entire way of life of Putin is doing people favors and then inevitably asking something in return, most of the times something much bigger than originally granted. Putin never forgets to collect his debts. It is almost like you got a flat tire on the highway and then you call your friend to help you with this problem, and then 5 years later your friend asks you to be his getaway driver because he wants to rob a convenience store, saying that, well, remember, I helped you fix your car. Well, now I need it for something I want to do. The presence of Russian forces without explicit consent highlighted the limitations of Belarus' sovereignty under Lukashenko's regime. It shows how Putin can leverage his influence to advance his strategic objectives, even at the expense of its allies' autonomy. International observers noted that Belarus was being used as a pawn in Russia's broader geopolitical game. The Belarusian public and opposition figures expressed unease over the foreign military presence. Obviously, there were fears that Belarus could be drawn into a conflict with Ukraine, further isolating the country internationally. Lukashenko, aware of these concerns, made attempts to assure both his citizens and the global community that Belarus had no intention of participating in any kind of aggression. For him, it was much worse to upset Putin and openly confront him, rather than hearing some backlash from the West. Putin let him keep the power. Putin can take it away. The worst can happen with the West are just some mere sanctions. So, that's why for so long Lukashenko tried to sit on two chairs at the same time, justifying Putin's actions and trying to stay as neutral as possible. But now, we can see that all of this defense of the Russian president was never genuine. On February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. One of the invasion's fronts originated from Belarusian territory, with Russian forces crossing into northern Ukraine. This move effectively made Belarus a co-conspirator in the eyes of many nations, despite Lukashenko's claim of non-involvement. The use of Belarus as a launching pad for the invasion demonstrated Putin's willingness to disregard Lukashenko's authority and the country's sovereignty. Lukashenko appeared to have little control over the situation. His previous attempts to maintain neutrality were rendered meaningless, as Russian troops already started advancing from his territory. International reactions were swift and severe. The European Union and the United States expanded sanctions to include Belarus, targeting key sectors of its economy and top officials. Belarus faced further isolation, compounding the economic and political pressures it already faced. Lukashenko's response was characterized by a mix of denial and deflection. He claimed that Belarusian forces were not participating in the invasion and that the Russian troops were acting independently. However, satellite imagery and intelligence reports contradicted his statements, showing coordination, clear one, between Russian and Belarusian military infrastructure. This period marked a significant erosion of Lukashenko's power and credibility. By allowing or being unable to prevent Russia's use of Belarusian territory for the invasion, he had crossed a line that alienated both his citizens and the international community. It was clear that Putin had sidelined him, pursuing Russia's objectives without regard for Belarus' interests. And when your alleged ally involves you in such a huge mess as a major war, literally next to your border, what other reaction would you expect from Lukashenko? He kept the anger inside him for almost 3 years, but eventually the tensions started rising. As we approach 3 years since the invasion began, the geopolitical landscape has continued to evolve. Lukashenko, it seems, can no longer hold his grudge against Putin and decided to let it out. By making small statements and showing small hints at first, just testing the water and seeing how Putin will react. Here are the potential factors that could have led Lukashenko to find the courage to speak against Putin and assert Belarus independence more forcefully. First of all, The prolonged conflict in Ukraine may have significantly weakened Russia's economy and military capabilities. Sustained sanctions, military losses, and international condemnation could have diminished Putin's influence both domestically and abroad. In such a scenario, Lukashenko might perceive an opportunity to distance himself from a weakened ally. And this is probably the most obvious and expected reaction in this scenario. Years ago, we already talked about the possibility of this particular event happening on our channel, guys, so which basically means as soon as Putin starts to show any signs of weakness, even his allies will start turning away from him one by one. The second scenario, internal pressures within Belarus could have reached a tipping point. The Belarusian population, burdened by economic hardships, which are further exaggerated by sanctions and the fallout from the pandemic, might demand a change in direction. Public sentiment could shift decisively against continued alignment with Russia, especially if the association brings only isolation and economic decline. The people of Belarus did not forget their dislike towards Lukashenko. Just because Putin helped him keep the power, it does not mean that sooner or later people will not rise against the regime once again. And Lukashenko definitely does not want to ask for Putin's help to solve the internal problems anymore. Scenario number 3 is that Lukashenko might seek to rehabilitate Belarus' international standing. By publicly opposing Putin's policies, he could attempt to open dialogues with the Western nations, aiming to lift sanctions and attract investments. Such a move would require significant concessions on issues like human rights and democratic reforms, but the potential economic benefits might force Lukashenko to at least consider this path. After all, he already tried siding with Putin, and it did not bring any desirable results. And lastly, regional dynamics could play a role. Neighboring countries concerned about Russia's aggression might offer incentives for Belarus to break away from Moscow's influence. Increased cooperation with the European Union or participation in regional security initiatives could provide interesting alternatives, instead of just hopelessly relying on Russia for everything. Belarus has a long way to go to restore its image in the front of the world's eyes, but, well, every long road starts with the very first step. If such a shift is to occur, it would represent a monumental change in Eastern European geopolitics. Lukashenko asserting himself against Putin could alter alliances, impact the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and reshape the balance of power in the region. Every major change starts with seemingly small events that dictators prefer to ignore, thinking that anything besides what they do is just insignificant and not even worthy their attention. And by the way, guys, for the next 2 weeks I will be uploading very special and personal episodes. Please subscribe to my channel if you don't want to miss them, because I will be sharing some very personal things. I was previously even debating whether I should talk about them or not. If you also miss ridiculous Russian propaganda, I do talk about it on my Patreon, so if you want to continue watching, please go ahead and check it, the link is down below. Thanks so much for watching, and see you on Monday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.